All right. Well, welcome to the 11th episode of the Society of Rugged Developers. Joined with me, your host, James Wickett. I have Lance Vaughn, one of the other hosts, Matt Konda, and the wonderful Matt Johansen from White Hat. Hey, everybody.
Hello.
All
Howdy.
right.
Thanks for having me.
We're glad to have you. So let me tell our guests, if they're not familiar with you, Matt, who you are. Matt runs the security or the threat research center over at White Hat. And if you're not familiar with White Hat scans actively 35,000 websites, and they are doing detection and assessment of vulnerabilities real time on a lot of web properties. They've released a really great report, the White Hat statistics. What's that called? The White Hat Application Security Report. They
That's
release that every
yeah.
year. Yep, it's a great data point if you're interested in this kind of thing and you get excited about the statistics of what's going on or depressed about them if that's sometimes the case. But anyways, today we thought we'd sort of take a look at the rugged landscape. We've been sort of trekking along and looking at the different characteristics, some of the process on how rugged is implemented, and we also have done some touching of like the things that rugged will bring to you. Well, one of the underlying tenets of rugged, I think that we sort of have skirted by over time, but I think that we're going to see more prevalent as we continue our discussion through rugged is the idea of detection, and we're talking about monitoring, detection, both in development and in like operational security and runtime, and we see it's important because if you were like to build like a Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you could see like monitoring like sitting right at the bottom or detection right at the bottom. So we thought Matt would be able to kind of help shed some light on the topic for us. And so, Matt, I wanted to kick off, like, where do you see detection fitting in kind of the rugged landscape, or in kind of like as people are putting together their security or rugged type programs?
Right. So I think that it really plays into one of the main lines in the manifesto, right? Your code's going to be used in ways that you can never imagine, right, by talented adversaries. So this detection of what they are using, like how these adversaries are using your code, or detection of vulnerabilities, whether it's in your source code or in a website once it's in production, are going to give you some insight into that exact piece of information, right? Okay, how is my code being used and abused in the ways that I could never imagine? Well, take your imagination out of it and actually detect what's going on, right? Detect what they're trying to do, or detect what they're gonna try to do because you found a vulnerability before before someone tried to use it, right? Whether it was a developer finding a vulnerability via static code analysis, or via some security analysis or audit of your website in some sort of staging or production environment, right? I think that really ties into being able to find and fix this stuff quickly, and making your your code more secure, faster, better, all that stuff. That ties right to the manifesto perfectly, I
Yeah,
think. So.
yeah, I would agree with you on that. But let me pause it, or let me ask you this: like, so let's say people aren't bought into security really being a problem, and they're not really sure that rugged. Uh, they don't understand kind of the tenets of rugged. They think hacking is a thing, or security problems are things that happen to other people, not them. In organizations where people have that sort of real, I don't know, I don't know how you would say it, but have such a kind of a naive view. How do you see monitoring, and detection playing out?
So I think that your question kind of answers itself in the sense that anyone who thinks that and says that is not doing monitoring and detection.
Yeah.
If you're not taking security seriously, you obviously aren't looking at your logs, right? Yeah. So there, what is it? What's the old saying, right? There's two kinds of people: people that have been hacked and people that don't know that they've been hacked. So yeah, it really comes down to monitoring and understanding what's going on so you can respond to it, or monitoring and understanding what kind of flaws are in your code so you can anticipate what's going to happen to it. Whether you're bought into it or not, that's going to happen. So.
And when you guys onboard people, I don't want to get too much on the white hat side, but when you guys
Right.
onboard people at white hat, as you're doing that, do you experience, either people that are way overconfident or that are just saying, oh, there's no problems, or and how do you deal with that? I don't know if that's.
Yeah, no, it's a fair question. Yeah, we see the whole spectrum, right? We see people that are really excited to have us pointing out flaws because they're eager and they don't have the time or the bodies in house to kind of sit and do these code reviews all the time. So they're excited for that data so that they can get on top of it. And then you have the people that this is their baby, and you're calling their baby ugly, and so there's some pushback there, right? And then you even have the people that it's complete shock, right? So it's like, hey, this is great. We're going to turn on this scanning and do some security stuff finally, and then all of a sudden, they have 1,000 new open bug tickets in their bug tracking software, and their developers are just like, oh wow, what happened, right? So I mean, you get the whole spectrum of it, right? Um, and I think all of them get their own usefulness out of the data no matter what, right? So I don't think ignorance is bliss here. Whether or not you're buried under it and you weren't expecting any of it, or you're really happy about getting the data is still really important, right? Like you need to know what's going on in order to react to it.
One of the things, Lance, we've talked about is how you kind of give that analogy, where it's like once you detect a problem, then you like work on, avoidance on that. How do you see detection playing in kind of in a dev shop?
Is that question to Lance? Sorry.
Yeah, that's a question, Lance. I don't know.
Well, it certainly is not something that's pretty standard in terms of deployment. I think you'll find most dev shops are focused on custom software development. And when it comes to deploying the code to production, it's either a quick push of a button and they forget about it, or they don't even do it, right? There are some custom dev shops that simply don't even handle the production side simply because they want to focus on development. Perhaps that's to allow them to focus just on development, or perhaps because they recognize that deploying code to production is not something that should be done quickly or without a lot of concern for things like threats and vulnerabilities.
I think another common, we talked about how people have that, either they kind of have ignorance in the space, or maybe they are overly confident in their code. I think there's another camp of people out there that think that security is one of those things where kind of like a magical, packet sort of sneaks its way into your application, and then just the whole thing just goes, belly up, and it dumps the entire database, and it's just like it's like basically unpreventable. What do you say to those guys?
To the magical packet believers.
Well, tell me that's not wrong. Somebody tell me that there aren't.
You're 100% correct, right?
I agree too, but I would be a little bit hesitant to characterize those folks quite so quickly, because I talk to developers all the time that really just don't understand. And it's not because they're dumb, it's because they don't understand, and partly because we're not doing a good job explaining it. So I agree that people think that there's this magical, somebody just pushed a button and something crazy happened and they'll never understand it. But I sympathize with those people in a way. Like, all right, I understand that it's hard to keep track of all the different things that are happening. But I still want to hear Matt's answer to the question.
Well, yeah, and I'll say to that as well. Some of that has been popularized by the media, right, and through the way that we sort of view the security community. Also, some of the research is sort of hidden on different pieces, and so there is kind of that magical nature approach to it. But yeah, sorry, Matt.
Yeah, no, I mean, this goes down to the whole spectrum of a whole nother podcast when it comes to user education and developer education, right? But just to touch on it, right, the whole magical packet thing I think it ties in perfectly to this monitoring and detection discussion, because if you were doing, successful monitoring of what's being attempted against your application, you're going to see that if anything was ever successfully exploited, it was never with one HTTP request, right? You're going to watch this person try to find and detect the vulnerabilities on your site for you. How nice of them, right? And they're not going to tell you about it. They're going to steal all the data. So, there's going to be tons and tons of stuff and tons of data that is leading up to a successful exploit that, most people are just letting go by the wayside, right? Just let those pile up in the logs, and, I think that's someone else's job to look at those log things, right? So, no, it really needs to be part of the, the whole rugged life cycle of understanding what your attack landscape is. What are people attempting, right? The key word there is attempting. Like, hopefully, the people are going to be attempting something before succeeding. So that magical packet being the successful one, what happened before that?
Yeah. I think we, well, yeah, Lance, I'll say this.
Yeah.
I sort of I was posed this question recently, and I think there's some thinking that, like, you can never defend enough, right? And that I'll never be able to build it secure enough. I'll never be able to do that. But I like to think that whenever you think about it in a rugged way, you start thinking of, like, just an incremental improvement or securing or ruggedizing one component, like, helps the other pieces. And if we cede to the attackers that we're not going to be, watching what's going on, both in our system, maybe in our application state, at different layers, wherever that is. If we completely cede kind of the home field advantage that we have, because we know our application, we know normal response, we know, basically we have that home field advantage, and a lot of times we cede that to the attackers and sort of make that as, like, an unpreventable thing, or something that we can't detect. And I think, do we do that too quickly? I feel like we do. I feel like a lot of times you hear security people or developers, maybe not so much developers. Actually, I hear mostly security people say this, like, oh, you can never build an impenetrable app or something that can't be defended or whatever. And that, I don't know. To me, that kind of disturbs me, because I think there is. We're just missing a lot of that detection piece, and so we don't really even know what's going on a lot of times.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. You always hear that joke, right? Oh, the secure computer is the one in a cement block, like, unplugged and all that kind of stuff, right? Like, we're really quick to make that joke and talk about how it's really impossible to do this when when you look at the data, you can severely reduce your risk profile, and that's what this whole thing is about, right? Like, you're trying to minimize potential damage in the future, period, right? If you get hacked, how bad is it going to be, right? So.
Yeah, I would love to go the rest of my life without hearing somebody say to turn off the network in the computer and to tie it to a cement block. I'm like, okay, that can't be, like, as a security community, that can't be the answer to the world, right? The answer to the world has to be something that's actually more pragmatic and useful. Sorry, and Lance, you were going to say something.
Yeah, no, that's okay. So I hear we're talking about detecting vulnerabilities, and it sounds like a security conversation. And I just want to, we've mentioned rugged a few times. I just want to make sure that our listeners are tying in the two, tying in detection of vulnerabilities with the rugged manifesto, with the rugged, the promise of developing quality software and the commitment to keeping security in mind as we're developing. So I'd kind of like to throw Matt a softball and ask him to one of the things we like to do is to ask our guests to give us their definition of what what is rugged, what does it mean to be rugged, how do you try to be rugged throughout your day, or how do you recommend either your customers or your employees do certain things to be more rugged on a day-to-day basis?
Sure. So, I think I think everyone should probably read the Rugged Manifesto. I already mentioned it earlier. I got some props in our chat here for mentioning it earlier, right? I think everyone should go read that, right, to get the understanding of what we're talking about. But, like, what's important in that to me is, and the part that I latch onto, and James has seen me kind of harp on this, I love the be mean to your code, right? Not treating your code like it's some fragile piece of china that you're about to put on the internet and hope that nothing that you didn't expect is going to happen to it, and then everything's going to be peachy and we're all going to go about our day, right? when the reality of it is that you're putting this piece of china into the den of bulls, right? Like you're putting it into in the wild wild west here, and everything is going to happen to it within minutes, right? I think that they do it every couple months. You see the stats of how long something goes on, how long before something hits the internet before it sees its first attempted attack or scan or something like that. It's you're talking seconds, right? It's not even minutes anymore. So I think that that really harps to it, right? So you need to anticipate all the bad things that are going to happen and be mean to your code and not treat it like this fragile piece of china, because once you put it on the internet, they're going to be mean to your code, right? And that ties into this whole monitoring and detection piece, because hey, if you're monitoring these people being mean to your code, that's lightening my workload, right? I don't have to be as mean to my code. These people are doing it for me. So, I think just watching that and being able to set up some system in any sort of way in your organization to feed the data that you're getting from that, it's invaluable, right? Your attack landscape and what people are attempting against you, like this all ties into your risk profile and lowering your attack surface and all of this. It all ties together, but you have to take the data and make it meaningful instead of just, hey, security guy, here's the logs, like go do something, right? Like,
right.
So.
And just to be clear, Matt, sorry, Matt, but just to be clear, you're not necessarily suggesting that the monitoring begins after we deploy the code to production, but you're suggesting that we're monitoring for threats and vulnerabilities throughout the entire development life cycle, correct?
Absolutely. I mean, I wouldn't be wearing this T-shirt if I didn't believe that. I hope some of the listeners are familiar with Gauntlet, right? Because James talks about it a lot, and it's really a great tool for exactly what you're talking about, right? Let's be mean to our code before it even sees a server, right? Hey, I wrote this code. Let me write some unit tests, write some end-to-end tests. Well, right there in that exact moment is the perfect time to be testing your code in some security fashion, right? And Gauntlet has a really great framework for at least a starting point for doing that against your own code, right? Let's make sure that code can't be executed here where I didn't think it was supposed to be, right? And let's make sure that this database query is written correctly, or that I included the CSRF token everywhere I needed to. All of these kinds of things. The earlier you find them in your development lifecycle, the way easier it is to fix. I think everyone on this podcast is or has been a developer to some sense, and everyone knows that mindset that you're in when you're in the zone and you're writing a piece of code, right? You can just disappear for a few days, right? My wife laughs at me. I'll be laying in bed like, oh crap, I got to get up and write this because it's in my head, right? And I'm doing this one piece of code, but once it's done and out there, and you move on to the next thing, the longer it gets from your brain, the harder it is to figure out what you did, 6 months ago or even last week or whatever it is, right? But if you find that problem while you're in that zone, while you're writing that code, how easy would it be to fix? I mean, you're talking minutes instead of hours, or instead of, hey, this piece of code is now owned by a whole nother development team and they got to figure out what I wrote and then figure out how to solve the security problem with it. Now you're talking days, right? So that's a great point. I'm really glad you brought that up, right? I'm not talking about production at all, right?
So can we slow down and assume, like, just pretend I'm a developer that doesn't know anything about security, which is only a little bit of suspending disbelief. What can I do to assist with detection? You said don't send me the logs, right? And I think you alluded to a number of things in that when you just sort of commented, but I'm curious if you could slow down and say, what specifically can a developer do to help with threat detection in an application?
So I think, like your average developer, how they can aid in this whole conversation, it really comes down to finding those threats in the code as they're writing it. A key part of that is understanding what those threats are. Right, so I think that's all part of the Rugged Manifesto. Is you're taking this seriously and not pretending that it's not your job to know this kind of stuff when you're writing this code, and you got to stop pretending that and start realizing, hey, I'm writing code that's going to be attacked by talented adversaries, right? I need to understand, at least to some degree, what those people are going to be attempting. And I think that the security people at any organization, I think it's their job or your job to help the developers out there, right? Like give them the corrective pieces of information that they can go and understand these threats, go and be able to run something like Gauntlet, and, tie that into your unit tests and your continuous integration servers and all this kind of stuff. If you can start to get an understanding of the kind of threats that are going to be attempted against your code, you can start to learn how to test for them while you're writing the code, or even understand them a little bit better, so that the code that you're writing, you might be able to look at it and say, oh wait, hey, didn't that security guy say something about user input, or SQL queries? I should probably stop and think about this for a second, or reach out and ask someone a question for a second, right? And then you're aiding in finding these problems earlier in the life cycle, right, before your code ever makes it to production.
That's awesome. So
an average developer can do, for sure.
That's awesome. Are there also things we need to do in the application so while they're actually running, we can get information out?
Yeah, I think that ties into the actual detection of what attacks are going on live while it's running, right? Hey, I just pushed this code. What changed, right? What changed in anything that I'm monitoring, right? Hey, I'm working on the login form. We're changing up our cookies a bit, and all of a sudden I see a spike in failed login attempts. What happened? Did I do that? Did something that I changed? Is that making it easier to brute force, users on my site? Did I change some error message so that it's too verbose? It's giving the attacker too much information about their login attempts. So something like that, right? Like, if you have the monitoring in place, the data starts to paint a picture that can actually make sense, right? Instead of just, I don't know, I worked on the login form and I pushed it, and it works, right? People are logging in, so no one complained.
Gotcha.
Well, and it's hard in a low traffic environment too sometimes, right? Because you can make a change to a thing, and it's not assuming that we don't have thousands of people scanning the site all the time,
right,
in some instances, and so it's very reasonable to think that you make a significant error, and then later it won't be for weeks or months or until it's actually discovered.
Totally.
And how do we put tracers? And I'd be curious to hear what everybody thinks on this. How do you put tracers or handlers or flags or some way to sort of tie back to the actual security flaw or event or problem in the runtime state? Are there any best practices you've seen people do, or how does that work?
I joked about this on the pre-call, right? So that you can't have this kind of conversation without bringing up Etsy, but I truly believe that they do some really cool stuff, right? But they kind of make the joke about themselves that they are a graphing company that also has a website that sells stuff. They graph everything, right? So they put these flags. I can't remember the software that they use at the moment. Graphite.
Graphite, yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
So they put these flags everywhere, right? So I brought up the login example from a story that I heard during one of their presentations or over beer with them or something, where anytime they have a login or a failed login, it pings to a graphite graph so that they have two lines of failed logins and successful logins, right? And then they have I think it's called Skyline. I think it's an open source software that they've put out on their GitHub page. We can include it in the show notes, I guess, right? And it's anomaly detection on those graphs. Hey, what changed, right? So logins is just one example, but how about 404 errors? How about 500 errors, right? Here's our average load of 500 errors, and all of a sudden something happened. What happened right there where that spiked or dipped or something like that? And the Skyline, I think that's what it's called. Their open source software is detecting these anomalies in their own graphs. So they're an extreme case, right? They've got a long history of setting these flags everywhere, but I think excuse me, is absolutely a best practice that people can strive for, to start monitoring as much as you can in any sort of meaningful way to try to detect not only when you push. So you made a great point, right? So I pushed something and nothing happened, and then weeks later something happened. How do I tie it back to that code that I just pushed, right? So if you try to lay these flags of events places and then try to do some anomaly detection, I think that really helps, right? Tie it to which code, is actually affecting that. It might not be any code. It could be something. Some new exploit kit was released, or some new Metasploit module was released, or something, right? Something could have happened that was completely unrelated to you, and someone is just attempting it across the entire internet, and something triggered on your site to, make that automated tool go back to its, command and control and say, hey, focus here, right? Hey, this person's running an old WordPress, like, check it out, right? Or something like that. So, but without that data and without those flags, it's really becomes really hard to tie it, and it's a great point. Tie it back to which code you need to actually focus on. So,
well, and I'm curious to think, is when you go back and you look at a lot of security literature, we take an approach of threat modeling, right? And we talk about the you can map stride or dread, or people are familiar with that in the security space, and if you're not, I totally think it's a worthwhile exercise. But to threat model an entire system, especially if it's already running, it can be pretty hard. But I like the idea of the kind of the application-specific or business-specific events that happen that are often kind of exhaust of security, either security attacks or attempts, or successful things that are happening, and so tying in things like user login, or I don't know, credit card database accesses, or new accounts created, or things like that. Things that are sort of the things that normally will happen whenever you are getting owned, or having some sort of security vulnerability exposed. Matt, Lance, any comments on that or thoughts on that?
Well, I wonder what it is about Etsy, and I know we don't want to probably spend too long talking about one specific case. But what you mentioned, Matt, that Etsy is an extreme case. What is it about their culture, or who within the organization at some point made a decision that we're going to be a graphing company, right? That we're really going to take all of these events and tags and instrument our code and observe the behavior of our code? How does something like that get started? And if one of our listeners is in a situation where they would like to implement that type of culture within their organization, how do they go about doing something like that?
It's a really good question. I can't really answer what change maybe spurred that internally, but what I do know that's unique about them, that's certainly helped move it along, is that everybody that works there has production, like push to production access. Like every single person that writes code there can just push to production, push the green button, it goes, right? And they have pretty extreme regression testing and all that kind of stuff, so that if anything breaks, it moves back and all that kind of stuff, right? But every single person has the ability to push code to production immediately, right? And they lean heavily on unit testing and continuous integration, so that if something ever happens because of that, they can kind of roll back, and they also have all this monitoring, so they can see if something happened. Hey, this code just went out, and this, that, and the other thing broke, right?
But even something so simple like that, Matt, just giving your developers the ability to push code to production. I mean, I will just suggest at least one client site where 0 developers have access to push code to production. What they need to do is they need to make it available in the dev environment, and then they send an email, or they update Jira to the QA team, and then they promote, and then from there it's just a series of cycles and theoretically months before code actually makes it to production, right? So what does someone do, or maybe is it the CIO or CTO or CISO that needs to say, we're going to start doing things in a more Etsy way, right?
And I don't know if it is the push to production that makes them so inherent, about watching about what's going on with security stuff. I think somebody that's approached with the, hey, everybody in the organization is going to have access to push production. Anybody who's going to take that and then kind of try to wrap some sanity around that, and some process, like the effect of that is incredible, right? It's like we realize we always want to push to production because we don't want a bunch of work in progress. We want to be real lean. We don't want to have a bunch of, we don't want to do 300 change, code deploys anymore. We just want to do one at a time. Beautiful, right? But the system you have to build around that, like you have to really understand your, you have to have good aspects of monitoring. You have to have lots of great testing. You got to have orchestration to make those services available, and treating security as just another facet of the system, and really thinking how do we ruggedize things that way. That makes a ton of sense. But I feel like the push, everybody gets it, push access to production is a cultural phenomenon, yes, but the way it changes your day-to-day work, as long as you're not just saying like, you can just let everybody push a production and then everything will break, right? If you don't put the right process pipeline monitoring, things like that. So it has such this crazy positive benefit in the rugged space that it's super hard to beat, because it's like you really are letting kind of your system go wild. You don't have the kind of the belief that you're that some sysadmin in a is going to perform the rituals and make everything okay to make it all. It's like that's the old school way of thinking about it, right?
Yeah, I mean it ties into the fragile aspect, right? Of, hey, this needs to be this exact way in order to stand up live on the internet and hope and cross our fingers that everything works, and if it doesn't, we'll just roll all 300 changes back, and then it'll take another 6 months before we figure out how to get it up there, right? Yeah. So, there's a bunch of obvious problems with that, right? But just to go back to Lance's question, right? So, of who needs to make that change, and how do you even start to make that change? Right, because a lot of developers listening, or even anyone that we're going to talk to, that it's just not going to be realistic, right? They're not going to be able to go back to their organization and say, hey, I think my whole team should have push access, right? That's just not going to happen. It's not going to happen overnight, especially, right? But I think, to James's point, I think all the things that Etsy does around that to make that possible are changes that people could make, right? A lot of this monitoring and regression testing and all this kind of stuff, you can start to make those changes way before you start to give people push access, and then maybe that makes it slightly more realistic in the future. But if it doesn't, and if your organization doesn't feel like taking that risk on, you still have all this awesome, tool and process in place to figure out what's going on, and you're making your code less fragile and magic, and and just hoping that all the servers work and everything like that, right? So I think you can really learn something from all the process that makes it possible for them, right? So the key might not be that everyone has code production, push to production access. I think the key might be all the things that allow them to do that, right? But one thing that we see a lot here at White Hat that might be lesser known to a lot of people, of some of the negative impacts of doing these giant pushes, and versus doing more frequent 1 to 2 code change pushes, that I always find really, really interesting, is that when a bug is found, so let's just say any bug is found, any sort of vuln is found, it's like regular old vulnerability, it gets added to the bug pile, the dev fixes it, it goes to QA, it gets added to the push for whenever the push is going to happen, right? Next month or something, right? When you have a high severity vulnerability, like a 5-alarm fire, holy crap, our whole database is exposed, right? You're going to get these types of fire drill type code development to fix it, and then get it as like an out of band push, right? We see this all the time, where it's like, okay, get this fix, don't push everything, get this fix live tomorrow, right? And do whatever you have to do, get this live, right? Because the CIO said so. Whatever that is, right? We see it all the time that those vulns have the highest reopen rates, because they went out of their whole process to band-aid this one thing and fire patch it, right? But they didn't include it in their pile. So who knows when the next push or the next push, whatever the next 3 staging environments that they have, they didn't include the fix in those, and then when one of them finally makes it to production, it overwrites and the bug comes back. At which point they don't detect it right away if they don't have very good detection and monitoring, and they don't worry about it because they had that whole fire drill 3 months ago. So we see that all the time. I think it's really fascinating, and I think it's like an under spoken about, problem when it comes to this sort of thing, right? Of these long time between code pushes and these giant code changes. So sorry for the long story. I always like telling that one.
That's very fitting. Yeah.
Yeah.
So as we try to engage with like the business and talk about, hey, we may need these process changes, or we want to do things more in a more of a rugged way, one challenge that I see is communicating about threats. And you're sort of in a very interesting position to talk about, different kinds of threats, how you can prioritize, how you can evaluate and communicate about, the severity of different things that are happening so that prioritization can happen.
Yeah.
Throw that out there and ask for comment.
No, yeah, it's totally. I mean, it's a huge point when it comes to this, right? It's like, okay, great, guys, thanks to the podcast full of awesome ideas that I can never implement because, it's just not going to happen because my company's already established that they're in their ways and, that we're slow moving and yada yada, right? It's a great question. I think a lot of the tools that I try to help in this conversation and try to provide to help in this conversation really come down to you got to talk in dollars and cents, right? If you're going to communicate to the business and you can't say, hey, Etsy does this and I'm a Zane Lackey fanboy and I want to do it because it's cool, right? Like you got to say, hey, if we do this, we're going to save X dollars, right? And that really comes down to, one of the stats that gets talked about a lot through OWASP channels and in our White Hat Stats report and, the Verizon data breach report is the cost of these breaches and the cost of mitigation. It pretty universally goes up the longer a Vaughn is around, right? And I talked about this earlier. Where the time to fix is relatively short if you detect the bug. The sooner the bug is written, that you detect it, the time to fix is shorter. And instead of saying that to the business, oh, well, it takes us less time to fix it, you got to say it's going to cost us a whole lot less to fix this, right?
Right.
Instead of costing it, 3, people hours for the next, however many weeks, or 3 people's worth of hours for the next how many weeks. Oh, it's going to take me 10 minutes because I just wrote that code yesterday, and oh yeah, I didn't parameterize that query. Hold on a second, right? And that starts to make a lot of sense to the business people. Hey, this is going to take me however long for a hot fix versus hey, it's already been through QA, it's already in production. We have to go figure out if anyone's attacked us on this because we found this vuln now. We got to figure out if anyone's been, using it against us. The dollars go up and up and up and up, right?
I also think that a group of the kind of decision makers or business level, they are the magical packet theorists, and so I think sometimes exposing just like what's actually going on, is also pretty helpful, right? Because your mitigation costs is one thing, but even convincing like that there's a problem, I don't know. How do you guys see that in your business at White Hat?
I mean, we see it all the time in trying to get business, right? Like it's like, hey, you guys need to find your vulnerabilities. Well, why? Well, why do we need to find them? We're not getting hacked. Like you brought it up earlier, right? Everyone thinks the magic packet might happen eventually, but why do I need to find all this stuff across all my websites, right? And I think that there was a major shift in this. I don't know, back in 2010, 11 area, where a lot of the detection that, the mindset behind detection and monitoring was always detect and monitor my flagship, right? My main website, the website with the most traffic, right? And then we saw a string of breaches that happened where it was some random web footprint from, potentially like another country or something, right? Say it's a U.S. based company and they have some South American domain that some users over there use, right? And then that website got whacked, and it was able to talk to the same database that the flagship website talked to, right? You started to see these things happening, and the mindset totally shifted towards, oh crap, I got to detect everything everywhere instead of just pouring all of my dollars and detecting onto mycompany.com. I didn't even realize I've got all these other things that I got to worry about. I think the hardest question that we ask at White Hat of our customers or potential customers is, how many websites do you have? Right? Like, companies just have no idea, right? And they don't know how to even answer that question, right? They'll give us like an IP address range, and it's like, okay, well, whose job is it? Like, what business unit owns this website versus this one? Who's checking the code in this one before it goes to production? Is it talking to the same database? Is it accepting credit card numbers? All these kinds of things are really hard, and people are just now starting to catch up to, oh wow, I have to realize, I have to worry about all this stuff. It's really, really easy for someone in your company to go and start a website nowadays. That hasn't always been the case, right? So I don't know if that answered the question, or if I danced around it and answered a few other questions.
Yeah, well, I think that that's a really good approach. I mean, and I also liked what we said earlier. I liked something you said earlier, and I know we're kind of coming along on time, but you said when you do the training, don't think that be like, oh, hey, I'm accepting input here, I'm putting something back on the page here, or doing something with the application. See that as an opportunity to engage the security folks in the organization. I really like that, because I think sometimes security people have rightly been categorized as like trying to make other people do their jobs, or try like, oh, if only those developers could get smart and learn some security, right?
Yeah.
But some of the smartest people I know are developers, and so we often there's a risk of like stereotyping and pushing that there. But I think the key is kind of trying to figure out ways in your organization to foster that collaboration between the two groups. And it's like, oh, I'm coming up to something. Maybe I should check with my friend, and like not say that I'm not advocating the problem to the security people, and the security people aren't saying like, oh, well, that's your problem to fix. But it's like some sort of like effort of collaboration in there, and helping either collaborate on the tests for the different things, or just knowing like, hey, I'm handling, user input's a great example. I'm handling that here, so what am I going to do differently?
Yeah, I mean, just being aware of, hey, I'm writing something that could potentially be dangerous, right? A thing that I really like to do to make people's like jaw drop sometimes is they used to be called like Google Dorks, right? But now you can go on and do GitHub Dorks, right? Like, hey, let's go search on GitHub for how many people are just having some GET request call, command shell on the web server, or let's go and see how many hard-coded Amazon keys, API keys, are just floating around in GitHub, and you can start to find these searches of people doing some things that they really shouldn't be doing, and it becomes a pretty easy way to show somebody that doesn't necessarily understand a lot of this stuff, hey, look at some of this bad stuff in code that other people are doing in the real world, right? So it's not like, oh, we pulled up Gruyere and it's like this Swiss cheese application, and it's while that's like a great tool to show people, like, hey, this is what you kind of need to do to be able to exploit cross-site scripting or something like that. They know that they're going to look at that, and they know that they're going to find bugs, right? But if you show them some real code, some people's code on GitHub, and say, hey, look, this is what they're doing, right? And you point out, hey, if you're writing something like this that's going to need to ever execute code, or if it's going to ever need to talk to the database, just maybe stop and think and say, hey, I'm writing something pretty high risk right now, right? Maybe I should pump the brakes here, and even if I don't understand the threats that could come of what I'm writing, just understand that you're writing something that could potentially turn out to be a sensitive security piece of code, right? So
I took this class in college.
Balance, right?
Yeah, I took this class in college. It was a law class, and at the end of it, the professor's like, you guys aren't going to know anything here. What you need to know is like when you need to talk to lawyers, and when you're going to get sued for something. Like it was like that was the whole reason they wanted everybody to take the class, is because like they know you're going to have problems in the future. And some of that is like what we're saying here. Like we're just know when to be cognizant of what's going on. Well, I know we're coming up to the end here. Lance, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, well, it's also recognizing that it's more than just writing software that we're talking about here. It's recognizing that when you deploy what you have written to the internet, and it is available to the world, ideally just your customers, but to black hat hackers and the world alike, recognize that there are some additional things that you're going to need to do to defend yourself and to be ready to detect intrusion, respond to that intrusion, etc. And so, if anything, that's the one thing that we want to share with folks out there. I mean, if you're doing anything more than just standing up a WordPress site and not customizing it, right? Just saying, boom, there's my little blog, and that's it. If you're doing anything more than that, you're going to want to think a little bit more about the implications of deploying custom code to the internet. So real quick, Matt, as we wrap up here, just take us out into the future a little bit. Where is cybersecurity going? Where is the trends in internet security going, and what can we do to prepare ourselves for the future?
Do my little
did you just say cyber?
I did say cyber.
Cyber. Drink.
I haven't yet learned why cyber is bad yet. So, are you drinking at work?
No, I wish you guys were doing this a little later. We could actually play this.
Wait till the show is over before we drink.
Yeah, I do my little Wayne's World going into the future. I think that we're just at the cusp of a lot of this stuff that we're talking about. That's why I think that we fall into the trap of feeling like we're beating a dead horse with some of this stuff, right? I made the joke earlier that it's hard to have one of these conversations without bringing up Etsy, but at the same time, we kind of need to keep talking about this because you have to realize how early on in all this we are, right? I still need to talk about web application security, even if I go to a security conference. The people coming to this conference are security people. I still need to explain what cross-site scripting and SQL injection are, at least a little bit sometimes, right? Because people aren't necessarily application security people, right? So we have to kind of beat this in. So we're right at the beginning here. The next 5 years of a lot of this, I think that it's not necessarily going to become the norm that anybody anywhere is pushing to production willy-nilly, and we all have these magical processes in place, but I think it's going to be at least a lot less shocking as we move forward here, right? I think there are some industries that are going to be slow to move as they've historically been slow to move, right? You see government and big financial and all this kind of stuff, they're just process paralysis, right? So they'll probably be last to adopt, but as we see these startups pop up and as we see these like bleeding edge type internet companies, I think that the way that Netflix and Etsy and all these other people are doing things is going to become a lot less shocking, right? I think, what was it, Velocity Conference in 2009, where someone first dropped and said, hey, yeah, we push 30 times a day or 10 times a day or something, whatever it was.
It was Flickr, and they said 10 times a day, and that was stuff just sort of everybody freaked out.
Everyone's like head exploded, right? Like, I mean, I think it, like at White Hat, like, I consider us a pretty high tech and young kind of company that we're not really full of process paralysis, and we weren't even, we were doing 2 weeks, and we've got it down to faster since then, right? But I think that's the approach right now for a lot of dev shops is, well, how do we get faster, right? How do we get leaner? How do we get, hopefully we can get the message out there, and another seed in these people's head is how do we get more rugged, right? Instead of just faster. So. Yeah, that's my optimistic view, semi-optimistic view of the next 5 years. We're going to have tons of new problems we never even thought of, though, which is what excites me and keeps us all employed. So
it's a non-stop uphill battle, in other words, and we're just getting started.
Yeah, I mean yeah, we're right at the beginning of it, right? Like
Yeah.
we're talking 2009 is yesterday in in terms of this conversation, right? And the whole how many pushes per day, uh, you know, as a unit of measure of how agile you are, right, is only going to get further and further, right? So we just have to do our due diligence to get the rugged message out there and realize that agile isn't everything, and you got to actually realize that it can't be fragile. Oh, I'm making rhymes, aren't I?
Oh,
Fragile, agile. Okay,
don't
I'll
don't
just
let
stop
your agile be so fragile.
there.
Well, hey, let me give a challenge to y'all and to our listeners, and just be thinking about this. So I think that um, the world has seen that desire for faster pushes, more frequent changes, smaller batch sizes, but they have like the incredible benefit of using the lean movement in manufacturing in the 80s, and how people started doing Kanban and kind of all that, the Six Sigma and all that, and we got to think of like how and that's the business justification is totally valid there. Like how do we do the same thing in rugged? And I think part of why we're talking detection today, and we'll probably circle back on this soon, is as we're detecting things either in production, in runtime, or in development, that is like actual business impact, and it's being transparent and showing the like what's actually going on there. So. I think with that we'll kind of close it out. We'll put some links for some of the mentioned things from this podcast on ruggeddev.org, and join us back here. I believe we'll be back here next week, but stay tuned. We're working on lining up some future guests, and so on behalf of all the Rugged Dev crew, just thank you and good night.
Peace out.
Thanks,
All
guys.
right. Hey, see y'all.